Welcome everyone, my name's Brett Drummond. I'm one of the co-founders of MStranslate, and I'm here to talk to you today about a newly published study that's looking into how milk consumption or proteins in milk may be linked to disease progression in multiple sclerosis. Now, you may have heard about this research because you may have seen some of the headlines that have been popping up online. Drinking milk may aggravate the symptoms of MS. Drinking milk may make MS worse. So what is the reality? What did the study actually show? And should you be changing all of your morning lattes across to a soy latte? We're going to delve into that paper in a second, but before I do, please do make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already. It's one of the best ways that you can support MStranslate and all of our activities, and make sure that you stay in touch with all of our video updates. And at the same time, remember, if you do like this video, give it a thumbs up when we're done talking. So the headlines have all been around whether or not this can impact on multiple sclerosis symptoms. Milk consumption may exacerbate symptoms, may worsen MS. So let's start with this part of the study, because actually the human part of the study was a very small component. Most of this study was done in an animal model. Now, this study was out of the University of Bonn from Germany and was published in PNAS. The link to the paper can be found in the description of the video if you do want to go and read it yourself. So let's start at the end of the paper. So at the end of the paper, they did look into some people living with multiple sclerosis. Now, this was just a small number of people. And in these people, what they were interested in seeing was whether or not there was any cross-reactivity between antibodies that could recognize a protein in milk called casein and a protein that forms part of the myelin sheath known as MAG. And so what they found in this was that there was a percentage, now it was less than half, but there was a percentage of people living with MS who had antibodies that could recognize the milk protein and a myelin protein. Okay. Now they also looked at people living with other neurological disorders, and they found that while they did find these cross-reactive antibodies in some of those individuals as well, it was more prevalent in the people living with multiple sclerosis. It was about 28% of people with the other neurological disorders that they looked into, and about 42% of the people living with multiple sclerosis. Now, what that actually means, we will go back and talk about the animal studies in a second, but I think what's important as the really first thing to focus on, considering the headlines that we've seen online, is that that is all that was looked at in terms of people living with multiple sclerosis. They didn't take those findings and do anything to do with symptoms or clinical progression or disease worsening. There was nothing done about that. So we're certainly not at a point yet, I don't think, where we can make any claims about any of the findings in this paper as it relates to disease progression in people living with multiple sclerosis. So in terms of those headlines, does drinking milk worsen multiple sclerosis symptoms? We don't have the evidence from this paper to make those conclusions at all. Now, let's go back to the start and talk about what they found in the animal studies to discuss why they went on to then look at this in terms of people living with multiple sclerosis. Now, there was a number of results found in the animal studies, and I'm not going to go into them all in detail now. I'm just going to really focus on the main one that there is, and then give you my thoughts on this paper overall. As always, if you do have more questions, please do comment below the video, and I'll do my best to respond to all of those questions as quickly as I can. So what they did, now to give you some background on this, there has been some evidence linking milk consumption to autoimmune diseases for a long period of time. It's important to note that humans are really probably one of the only species on the planet that will drink the milk from another animal or from another species into adulthood. So there is some suggestion that there are some milk proteins, and in particular, the one that I mentioned before, casein, could have a link to autoimmune diseases. So what they did in this study is that they took some mice and they injected these mice with that milk protein, casein. And they looked at these mice over a period of time, out to 60 days. And what they found by day 40 in some of these mice is that there was problems in the central nervous system. So they were monitoring these mice to see whether there were any clinical symptoms that developed in the mice. And so they could see generally what they termed weakness. There was possibly some problems in terms of their mobility, and there was some problems maybe cognitively in terms of they seemed to be wandering around not with a purpose. Sometimes they seemed a little bit confused. When they then went on to look at what might be causing this, they could see that the animals who had been injected with the casein, with that milk protein, did have some damage around their central nervous system. There was damage there. Interestingly, they found that in some mice where they had injected them with other milk proteins, they didn't see that same damage. So it seemed to be specific for the casein. When they went on to investigate this further, they wanted to see whether or not there was the possibility that whatever was reacting against casein, or whatever the immune response was that was being generated against the casein protein, may be what's causing the damage to the central nervous system. And so they tested the antibodies that they found that reacted against the milk protein, and they found that those antibodies could also recognize a protein in the central nervous system, again, which I mentioned earlier, known as MAG. And so MAG is a protein that sits on the outside of the myelin sheath, remembering that the myelin sheath is the insulating layer that coats our nerves and that is targeted in multiple sclerosis. It is the damage to the myelin sheath that causes a lot of the clinical symptoms that we see in MS. So they were able to find here that in these mice that exhibited some clinical symptoms after they had been injected with casein, that the antibodies that could recognize casein could also recognize part of the myelin sheath. So what does this all mean? Well, firstly, what I think we don't want to do is jump to all of these conclusions and say that people with MS definitely shouldn't be drinking milk because it's going to be bad for their health and make their disease a lot worse. I think we want to avoid that panic despite what a lot of the headlines online are saying. However, it is interesting to think that, considering what we know about diet and multiple sclerosis and all of the work that's being done into that, it's interesting to see that here is something where they can actually find a link between a protein contained within a product that may be part of a normal diet, in this case, cow's milk. And it's important, so I should have stated that they were looking at cow's milk and the casein specifically from cow's milk, and a link between that and an immune response that can get directed against the central nervous system. Now, I think there are a lot of questions that we still need to answer. Firstly, we don't know how this transfers across to people living with multiple sclerosis. As I said, in a relatively small percentage, less than half of the people with multiple sclerosis that they looked into to see whether they also had these antibodies, and it wasn't a large number of people either, they only found them in 42%. So this is certainly not something that was in everyone. Now again, we need to look into more about what their dietary consumption was and things like that. But so there may be a subset of people living with multiple sclerosis that have these antibodies. Okay, we need to know more about that. At the same time, I think there is still a question around whether or not these initial antibodies are actually against the myelin sheath and then can actually then react against the milk protein. So it's a bit of a chicken and an egg here. We don't quite know what comes first. Now, in the animal study, it seems as though obviously it was the injection of the milk protein that caused this to happen. There was no problems beforehand, but we need to see what the case is in people living with multiple sclerosis. We know that a lot of the research that happens in animal models, while incredibly important for medical research, doesn't necessarily always translate across. So there's still a lot more to find out. It's interesting, but there's much more that needs to be done in this space. Potentially, if this was found to be a factor, then maybe we would be able to look into and see what subset of people had these antibodies. And in those people, we could suggest that maybe having a milk substitute and not taking cow's milk may help benefit them in terms of their health as it relates to multiple sclerosis, but we are not there yet. So hopefully that provides an easy to understand summary of the research that's been going on. If you've seen it before online, hopefully that helps answer some of the questions that you may have had about it. If this is the first time that you're hearing about it and you have further questions, as I said before, please do comment below. We will be following this research. We know that it's obviously an area of interest because it is diet related, it is lifestyle modifications, and we know that that is of interest to our community. So we will be providing updates on this research as soon as it comes to hand. As I said, if you do like this video, please do give it a thumbs up so that more people can see it. It's one of the best ways that you can support our channel. Thanks, everyone.